When I was a child, pastors were very serious men. My pastors always wore black. They seemed old, though I now know that some of them were not. They were very stern and not easily amused. They preached in thunderous voices, and when it was time for the assembly to pray, they always turned their backs on us. I asked my mother once, I said, "Mom, why did he turn his back?" And she whispered, "He's talking to God." When I was a child, the church altar was affixed to what we call the east wall, often separated from the rest of the sanctuary by many stairs and what looked to me like a fence. On those rare occasions when communion was offered only to adults, not to children, that altar rail was closed, leaving the pastor back turned next to all the beautiful things and all of us looking on at a distance. And when I was a child, no one spoke in church during worship. Not even a child would cry. They knew that they were in serious trouble if they did. No one shook a hand in exchange of peace. Everyone was dressed up, and no one seemed happy to be there. When I was a child, everything about church was serious and beautiful and dignified and distant. Even God. By the time I was ordained, Vatican II had completely reorganized the way we thought both about worship and worship spaces. Altars were pulled away from the wall and were called tables. Pastors no longer turned their backs to pray, but faced the assembly as though we were in conversation. Children sing anytime they want. People chat anytime they want. Flip-flops, which we used to call thongs but is no longer appropriate, flip-flops and shorts are more common than coats and ties. Now that I am an adult, everything about church is congenial and near and warm and welcoming. Even God. So which is it? God is distant and serious, or near and friendly? Trinity Sunday is the oddest of all the church festivals, marking not an event in the life of Christ or the church, but an idea, a doctrine, an attempt to put words to our experience of God. We who describe ourselves as Trinitarian, as opposed to those who don't believe in a three-person God, who are Unitarian, one, we hold two completely contradictory ideas together in a single word. The first of those contradictory beliefs is that there is only one God. That belief is called monotheism, right? One God, and dates back to the time of Moses, when at the burning bush, God said to Moses, "Here's my name. My name is I, singular, I am." No longer were God's people to worship the pantheon of gods that all their neighbors did, but one God, capital G. But the other side of that contradictory understanding is that we know that single, unique God in a whole variety of ways. Today, we use three particular names. We call God Father, whether Abba or Pater, you get to decide. We call God Jesus. We call God Spirit, and all those names are accurate, though certainly there are more. A single God, monotheism, in three persons, Trinitarianism, and each of those three persons, by whatever name we call them, always in communication with the others. This morning, your prelude reminded me of that, your voices mixing and blending, not ever singing the same thing, but working. That's how I imagine the Trinity. It's a hot mess of a theological concept, but it is what we believe. And we spend our lifetimes trying to understand. Today's texts attempt to describe this multifaceted unity, describing God who is one and three It is the Isaiah text that intrigues me most because it speaks to a particular issue that has troubled me since I was a child. God is distant. God is near. Can God be both? Isaiah reports a vision in which God is high and lofty in a room filled with smoke, God's garment so large it covered the floor of the worship space, and seraphs, whom we like to imagine are those little Renaissance cherubs, you know, with the lovely round faces and the little flappy wings. In fact, seraphs are flaming, flying, singing snakes. Seraphs attend God. That's why all the wings, right? Their praise is so loud, the building shakes. You guys didn't do that today, but I've heard you do that. The scene is cacophonous and chaotic, smoky and frightening. Isaiah, in a vision, sees a God who is to be feared. Isaiah, meanwhile, quakes at a distance. He lies prostrate on the floor, confessing that he and his mother and all his uncles and anybody he ever knew is completely worthless, lost, and sinful, people of unclean lips. The distance between them could not have been greater. God was distant. Isaiah was petrified. And then something happened. Something came between them to bridge the gap. This morning, in a few minutes, our sister Katie will stand before us to affirm the faith in which she was baptized. Her parents told me that when she was baptized, they sat in that very same pew with her in their laps. Please don't. They carried her to the font that day to make promises on her behalf, promises to raise her in the faith, to introduce her to the people of God, to teach her to pray. They will not carry her forward today. Today she walks on her own 2 feet. She's been preparing for this day for 2 years. With us, she will recite the Apostles' Creed. She will take on for herself the exact same promises her parents made 13 years ago, but in a bold and faithful move. She will also acknowledge that something stands between her and God, that she would be happy to have bridged, that something stands between all of us and God. In a set of 3 renunciations, she will admit to the enormity and the complexity of the sin that separates us from God and one another. I will ask her 3 questions. The first is this big, the second is this big, and the third is this big. Each one more specific and closer to home. Do you renounce the devil and all the forces that defy God? I will ask her, do you push away from yourself everything in the cosmos that is dark and ugly and frightening and antithetical to God's love? And she will say, yeah, I renounce that. And then we come closer. Do you renounce the powers of this world that rebel against God? Poverty, hunger, war, anger. And she'll say, yeah, I renounce all of that too. And then I will say, do you renounce the powers of this world that draw you from God? Those things in our hearts, those dark, frightened places in us that make it so hard to believe that God loves us. And she will say, yeah, I renounce that too. These are enormous questions for anyone, but particularly for a 13-year-old girl. But Katie is far more willing to answer those questions than most of us are. And then after admitting to the cosmic struggle in which we are all engaged, we promise her that God is very near. I will place my hands on her warm, shiny hair and pray the Spirit of God into her, as Pastor Bravin paid. Was it Pastor Bravin who baptized her? Pastor Gerald. Sorry, so many pastors before me, I lose track. Pastor Gerald laid his hands on her head. And I will pray for you faithfulness. I will pray that God will guide you. We will pray that your life will be devoted to usefulness. We will acknowledge that you will suffer, as we all do. And we will acknowledge that one day you will die. And we will pray all the power of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, into your life again today. Because God is distant and God is near. God is one and God is three. God defies definition, and yet we call God Dad, Mom. It was the seraphs, unlikely candidates, flying, flaming, snake-like creatures that bridged the gap between God and Isaiah with a hot coal on the lips and the promise of forgiveness. Today, the gap is bridged again as a teenage girl steps into the space between God and us. And when God says, "Whom shall I send?" Katie will say, "Me. Here I am. Send me."